Moran clicked his 4 clawed fingers against the metal desk, staring at the holographic display of his workstation with the kind of soul-crushing boredom that only a mid-level bureaucrat could truly appreciate. Station Nexus 7's Galactic Immigration Processing Center hummed with the usual monotonous activity, the soft whirring of data processors, the occasional frustrated sigh from a rejected applicant, and the steady tap-tap-tapping of styluses against digital forms. As a Zephyrian, Moran stood nearly 7 feet tall when he bothered to straighten his lanky frame, with pale blue skin that had a slight metallic sheen under the station's artificial lighting. His elongated skull housed what his species considered a superior intellect, though at the moment, that intellect was being used to rubber-stamp visa applications with mind-numbing efficiency. "Next," he muttered, not bothering to look up as another file materialized on his screen. Then he saw it. The file header made his secondary eyelids blink in surprise. Deathworld Origin Terra. Red warning stamps covered the digital document like some kind of bureaucratic rash. Extreme caution. Advised. Species classification. Apex predator. Gravity tolerance. 1.2 G standard. Atmospheric composition. Death mixture. Moran's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a Zephyrian chuckle. Oh, this was going to be entertaining. Moran leaned back in his ergonomic chair, savoring the moment like a fine Alterian wine. The application belonged to one Amy Kowalski, and according to her file she wanted a cultural exchange student visa to study at the prestigious Andorian Art Institute. Art, the irony was so thick you could cut it with a plasma blade. He pulled up her identification photo and nearly burst into laughter. The image showed a small, delicate-looking creature with soft brown hair that fell in gentle waves around a heart-shaped face. Her eyes were bright green and sparkled with what appeared to be genuine warmth and friendliness. She couldn't have weighed more than 50 kilograms soaking wet, and her smile was so innocent it practically radiated sunshine and rainbows. This was supposed to be a Deathworld survivor. "Hey Morton," Moran called out to his colleague at the next processing station. "You have got to see this." Morton, another Zephyrian with slightly more orange-tinted skin and a perpetually skeptical expression, glided over on his hovering chair. His species moved with an efficient grace that made other aliens envious, though right now he just looked curious. "What's got you so amused?" Morton asked, peering at the holographic display. "Look at this," Moran said, gesturing dramatically at Amy's photo. "Apparently this little flower wants to study art, and she's from Terra. You know, that legendary Deathworld that supposedly produces the galaxy's most dangerous predators." Morton's mandibles clicked in amusement. "That tiny thing? Are you sure the file's not corrupted? Maybe there's been some kind of database error." "Nope, it's all here," Moran said, scrolling through the documentation. "Born on Terra. Raised on Terra. Survived Terra's allegedly lethal environment for 22 standard years. And now she wants to paint pretty pictures." Both aliens burst into laughter that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "I'm telling you," Morton said, wiping a tear from his compound eye. "Humans are the galaxy's greatest marketing department. They've convinced everyone that their little garden world is some kind of hellscape just to make themselves seem more intimidating in galactic politics. Right?" Moran agreed. "I mean, look at her. She looks like she'd apologize if a butterfly landed on her nose too hard. And we're supposed to believe she survived childhood on a planet where everything wants to kill everything else." They continued chuckling as Morton returned to his station. Moran stared at Amy's photo again, shaking his head in amazement at human audacity. The Deathworld classification was probably some elaborate bureaucratic prank that had gotten out of hand. There was no way this sweet-looking little creature could be dangerous to anyone except maybe some unfortunate flowers she might accidentally step on. This was going to be fun. 3 hours later, the processing center's main doors slid open with their usual pneumatic hiss, and in walked Amy Kowalski herself. Moran looked up from his current case, a Regillian trader's permit renewal, and nearly choked on his afternoon stimulant beverage. The human looked exactly like her photo, only somehow even more fragile in person. She wore a bright yellow sundress covered in tiny blue flowers that made her look like a walking garden, and her brown hair was pulled back with what appeared to be a handmade clip decorated with small earth daisies. She carried a worn leather satchel that bulged with what were obviously art supplies, sketching pads poking out from the top alongside colored pencils and brushes. When she walked, she practically bounced on her toes with enthusiasm, and her smile could have powered the station's lighting grid for a week. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the information kiosk near the entrance. Her voice was soft and melodious, with just a hint of nervousness. "I have an appointment for visa processing." Amy Kowalski, the automated kiosk, programmed to handle dozens of species, responded in standard galactic common. "Please take number 847, and wait for your designation to be called." Amy thanked the machine politely, took her number, and found a seat in the waiting area. She immediately pulled out a sketch pad, and began drawing, occasionally looking up at the various aliens around her, with obvious fascination and delight. Moran watched all of this with growing amusement. Oh, this was too perfect. Here was his chance to have some real entertainment during what had otherwise been a mind-numbingly boring shift. He deliberately began processing other applications at a snail's pace. A Centaurian merchant, who'd been waiting for 20 minutes. Suddenly, Moran needed to verify 17 different trade regulations. A Betazoid student, whose paperwork was perfectly in order. "Time for a comprehensive background check." "What are you doing?" Morton asked, noticing Moran's sudden attention to detail. "Having a little fun with our Deathworld princess over there," Moran replied quietly, nodding toward Amy. "I want to see how long little Miss Sunshine can maintain that cheerful attitude when faced with some real bureaucratic pressure." Amy, meanwhile, continued sketching happily, occasionally showing her drawings to a young Altarian child, whose parents were also waiting. The kid giggled at Amy's cartoon-style portraits of the various species in the waiting room, and Amy gave the drawing to him as a gift. "Look at that," Moran whispered to Morton. "She's making friends. How absolutely precious. I bet she's never encountered a real challenge in her entire sheltered little life." 2 more hours passed. Amy had filled half her sketchpad, helped an elderly Volcorian find his dropped medication, and somehow convinced 3 different species to pose for quick portraits. She never complained about the wait, never asked how much longer it would take, and never stopped smiling. "Persistent little thing, isn't she?" Morton observed. "Oh, she'll break eventually," Moran said confidently. "They always do, especially the soft ones from easy worlds pretending to be tough." He processed 2 more cases, making sure to take his sweet time with each one. Amy's number was now 47 positions overdue to be called, and still she sat there peacefully, now reading what appeared to be a book on Andorian art history. Moran cracked his knuckles and prepared for the show. Time to see what this alleged Deathworlder was really made of. Number 847, Amy Kowalski. Moran finally announced, his voice dripping with false authority. He deliberately mispronounced her last name, making it sound like Kowalski instead of the proper pronunciation. Amy looked up from her sketchpad, smiled brightly, and practically skipped over to his desk. "That's me. Thank you so much for your patience. I know you must be incredibly busy." "Oh, this was too easy." Moran gestured languidly at the chair across from his desk, watching as Amy settled herself with the same cheerful energy she'd maintained for the past 5 hours. Her sundress was slightly wrinkled from sitting, but she still looked like she'd stepped out of some kind of pastoral painting. "So," Moran began, deliberately not looking at her as he pulled up her file, "Amy Kowalski, from the supposedly dangerous world of Terra." He emphasized the word supposedly like it was some kind of joke. "You want to study art?" "Yes, sir." Amy's enthusiasm was genuinely painful to witness. "I'm particularly interested in Andorian landscape techniques. Their use of chromatic resonance to convey emotional depth is absolutely fascinating, and I believe combining their methods with Terran perspective theory could create some truly innovative Moran cut her off with a dismissive wave. And you're telling me you survived 22 years on a Deathworld? You? Amy blinked, her smile faltering slightly. Well, yes, I was born and raised in Colorado, which is in the North American continent. It's actually quite beautiful. The Rocky Mountains have this amazing way of catching the light during sunrise that... Right. Moran leaned back in his chair, making a show of examining her application with exaggerated skepticism. And these Rocky Mountains are filled with deadly predators, I suppose. Creatures that could tear apart a seasoned Klingon warrior. Oh well, we do have mountain lions, bears, rattlesnakes. Amy began helpfully. Moran snorted. Bears, how terrifying. I'm sure these bears are absolutely massive killing machines, and not just some oversized furballs that eat berries. Amy's smile became a bit more forced. Actually, grizzly bears can weigh up to 800 pounds and run 35 miles per hour. They're quite dangerous if you don't respect their territory. 800 pounds, Moran repeated mockingly. Morton, did you hear that? 800 pounds of pure terror. His colleague chuckled obligingly from the next station. Amy's hands tightened slightly on her satchel, but her voice remained polite. Is there something wrong with my application, sir? All my documentation should be in order. Moran pretended to study her papers more carefully, deliberately taking his time. Let me see here. Educational background adequate, I suppose. Medical clearances surprisingly thorough for someone from such a primitive world. Financial guarantees. He paused dramatically. Oh, what's this? He reached for his cup of Zephyrian coffee, a thick, acidic brew that was mildly toxic to most non-Zephyrian species. As he lifted it to examine her financial documents more closely, he let his grip slip just enough for the contents to splash across Amy's art portfolio. Oops, he said with mock concern as the corrosive liquid began eating through the leather cover and seeping into her carefully organized sketches and paintings. How clumsy of me. Amy stared at her ruined portfolio for exactly 3 seconds. Her artwork, months of preparation for her application, years of practice and dreams was dissolving into acidic sludge before her eyes. When she looked back up at Moran, her smile had become something else entirely, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's okay, she said, her voice still determinedly cheerful but with an undertone that made Morton glance over nervously. Accidents happen. I have digital copies of most of these. Oh good, Moran said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Wouldn't want your little hobby to be completely ruined. Though I have to ask, Miss Kowalski, is there perhaps some problem with your application that you're not telling me about? Amy carefully moved the dissolving portfolio away from her dress, the acid having eaten through the leather, and begun working on the metal clasps. I'm sorry, I don't understand. What kind of problem? Moran stood up, unfolding his full 7 feet of height and looming over the desk. In Zephyrian culture, height was directly associated with authority and intelligence, and he used every inch of his advantage now. The kind of problem where a soft little creature from an allegedly dangerous world thinks she can waltz into our civilized space and demand the same treatment as real citizens. I'm not demanding anything, Amy said quietly, her hands now clasped tightly in her lap. I'm just applying for a student visa. I've followed all the proper procedures. Have you? Moran leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk and bringing his pale blue face closer to hers. Because it seems to me like you and your entire species have been living a lie, pretending to be dangerous when really you're just this. He gestured dismissively at her entire being. Amy's smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by a carefully neutral expression that somehow seemed more dangerous than her earlier cheerfulness. I see, she said softly. And what, exactly, do you think I am? Moran's mandibles clicked with amusement. A fraud, a pretender, a soft little thing from a soft little world who's been hiding behind scary stories and bureaucratic classifications. You want to know what I think about humans and your so-called death world? He began pacing behind his desk, warming to his subject like a professor delivering a lecture to particularly dim students. I think Terra is probably some kind of garden paradise where the most dangerous thing you face is deciding what color flowers to plant. I think your species invented all these stories about deadly wildlife and harsh conditions, because you were embarrassed about being so pathetically weak compared to real civilized species. Amy's voice was very quiet now. Is that so? Oh yes, Moran continued, clearly enjoying himself. And I think it's time someone told you the truth about your place in the galactic hierarchy. Humans need to learn proper respect for superior species. You need to understand that out here, in real civilization, cute little art students from make-believe death worlds don't get special treatment. Moran walked around his desk, positioning himself directly in front of Amy's chair so he could look down at her from his full intimidating height. This close, he could see that her bright green eyes had gone completely flat, like still water before a storm. So here's what's going to happen, he said, reaching down to grab her application documents from where they lay scattered on his desk. I'm going to review your case very, very carefully. Every single detail, every stamp, every signature, every medical clearance. And if I find even the tiniest irregularity, he let the threat hang in the air as he waved her papers just out of her reach. Amy's eyes tracked the movement with laser focus. Please give me my application back, she said, her voice so level and controlled it almost sounded robotic. Oh, I don't think so. Moran chuckled. Not until we've established some proper boundaries here. You see, fragile little Earth girls shouldn't be allowed to travel through civilized space unsupervised. It's dangerous out here. Real dangerous, not your make-believe Terra dangerous. He was really warming to his theme now, feeling more powerful and authoritative than he had in months. Finally someone he could put in their place. Someone who couldn't fight back, or file complaints or cause real problems. Maybe what you need is a nice rejection stamp on this application, he continued, holding her papers higher, so she'd have to stand up and reach for them if she wanted them back. Maybe a few months back on your little garden world would teach you some humility, some proper respect for species that actually matter in this galaxy. Amy stood up slowly, and Moran felt a moment of satisfaction. See, she was finally showing some appropriate deference, finally understanding her place in the natural order of things. I'm going to ask you one more time, Amy said, and her voice was so cold it could have flash-frozen hydrogen. Give me my papers back, and step away from me. Moran threw back his elongated head and laughed, the sound echoing through the processing center like breaking glass. Or what? What exactly do you think you're going to do about it, little flower? That's when he made his final fatal mistake. Still chuckling at his own wit, still drunk on his perceived power, he reached out with his free hand to pat Amy on the head like she was some kind of pet. His long clawed fingers were just inches from her brown hair when he said the words that sealed his fate. Maybe I need to teach you some proper man. He never got to finish the sentence. Amy moved. The motion was so fast, so fluid, so perfectly executed, that every security camera in the processing center would later need to be slowed down to frame-by-frame analysis just to understand what had happened. One moment Moran was reaching down to condescendingly pat the head of what he thought was a harmless little art student. The next moment, he was airborne. In a single devastating motion that lasted less than 2 seconds, Amy's right hand shot up and grabbed Moran's outstretched wrist with a grip like a plasma cutter. Her left hand seized his elbow, and she pivoted on her right foot with the kind of precision that would have made a Vulcan combat instructor weep with envy. What happened next was a masterpiece of applied physics and controlled violence. Amy's hip became a fulcrum as she executed what Earth martial artists called a Seyo Nage's hip throw, but with a modification that no textbook had ever documented. As Moran's 7-foot frame went over her shoulder, she applied a twisting motion to his spine that was so subtle, so expertly calibrated, that it cracked his vertebrae in exactly 17 places without severing his spinal cord. The sound that echoed through the Galactic Immigration Processing Center was like a gunshot fired inside a cathedral. Crack! It reverberated off the metal walls and synthetic floors, causing every conversation to stop mid-syllable, and every head to turn toward the source. Moran hit the floor with a wet thud that spoke of serious structural damage to both his body and his pride. His elongated limbs were twisted at angles that definitely weren't covered in standard Zephyrian anatomy textbooks, and the sound that came out of his mandibles wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a gurgle, but was definitely the noise of someone whose day had taken a very sudden turn for the worse. Amy straightened up, smoothed down her yellow sundress, and looked down at the writhing bureaucrat with the same expression she might use to observe a mildly interesting insect. "I did warn you," she said conversationally. The processing center fell into a silence so complete that you could have heard a Betazoid's thoughts from 3 systems away. The only sound was Moran's continued agonized screaming from the floor, where he was discovering that having your spine cracked in 17 precisely calculated locations was not, in fact, a pleasant experience. Every alien in the building turned to stare at Amy Kowalski, the tiny human in the flower print sundress, who had just turned a 7-foot bureaucrat into a pretzel with less effort than most species used to open a particularly stubborn jar. A Klingon warrior, who had been waiting to renew his combat license permit, was staring at Amy, with what could only be described as professional respect, mixed with healthy terror. A Centaurian merchant had dropped his trade documents, and was backing slowly toward the exit. Even Morton, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, was gripping his desk so hard his knuckles had turned white. Amy calmly walked over to where her papers had scattered when Moran dropped them, bending down to collect each document with the same methodical care she'd shown while organizing her art supplies earlier. She straightened each form, aligned the corners perfectly, and checked to make sure none had been damaged by Moran's acidic coffee or his subsequent rapid contact with the floor. "Excuse me," she said, turning to address the room in her original sweet, cheerful voice. The contrast between her sunny tone and the sounds of agony coming from behind her was so jarring that several aliens actually flinched. "I'm really sorry about the disruption, but I was wondering if someone else might be able to help me with my visa application. Moran seems to be having some technical difficulties at the moment." She gestured politely toward where Moran was still writhing and making sounds like a broken air recycling unit. "I promise I'll be very quick and polite. I just want to study art at the Andorian Institute. I'm particularly interested in their landscape techniques." The silence stretched on for several more seconds. Then from somewhere in the back of the processing center, a small voice squeaked, I can help process your application, miss." Amy turned toward the voice with a bright smile that made half the room take an involuntary step backward. "Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's patience with this whole situation." She walked toward the volunteer clerk, with the same bouncing step she'd entered with, stepping carefully around Moran's sprawled form. As she passed him, she glanced down with what might have been genuine concern. "You should probably get that looked at," she advised helpfully. "Spinal injuries can be really serious if they're not treated properly." Admiral Vashi arrived in the processing center exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds later, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone had just interrupted his very important afternoon planning session with some very urgent news. The Altarian Admiral was known throughout the sector for his calm professionalism and unflappable demeanor, but right now he looked like someone who'd just been told that his favorite restaurant had been converted into a tax office. "What in the 7 hells happened here?" he demanded, taking in the scene. One broken bureaucrat on the floor being attended to by medical personnel, one cheerful human girl chatting pleasantly with a visibly shaken clerk, and about 30 other aliens standing around looking like they'd just witnessed their deity stub its toe. "Security footage, now," he barked to his aide. 3 minutes later, after watching the recorded incident in real-time, slow motion, and frame-by-frame analysis, Admiral Vashi walked over to where Amy was patiently waiting while her new application was processed. "Miss Kowalski," he said formally, "I want to personally apologize for the unprofessional behavior you experienced here today. Your visa is approved immediately with full diplomatic courtesies." "Oh, thank you so much," Amy beamed at him. "That's incredibly kind of you. Furthermore, the Admiral continued, his voice taking on a slightly hopeful tone. "I'd like to offer you a position with Galactic Security. We could use someone with your particular skill set." Amy tilted her head thoughtfully, considering the offer with obvious sincerity. "That's really flattering, Admiral, but I think I'll stick with art school. I just want to study painting techniques, and maybe do some nice landscape work. Violence really isn't my thing." As she spoke, the medical team was loading Moran onto an anti-gravity stretcher. The chief medical officer was explaining to Admiral Vashi in hushed, amazed tones that the patient's spine had been cracked in exactly 17 places using a technique so advanced that their best combat specialists had never seen anything like it. The precision required to inflict that much damage without actually killing the target suggested a level of martial expertise that was frankly terrifying to contemplate. Amy collected her newly processed visa, thanked everyone politely for their help, and headed for the exit. As she walked through the processing center, every single alien gave her a respectfully wide berth, pressing themselves against walls and desks to make sure she had plenty of room to pass. Just before she reached the door, she turned back and waved cheerfully at the room. "Thanks again, everyone. You've all been so helpful." The door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, leaving behind a room full of aliens who were all having the same thought. Maybe those warning labels on Terran files weren't jokes after all. Within 6 hours of the incident, security footage from Station Nexus 7's processing center had been uploaded, downloaded, shared, remixed, analyzed and memed across every single communication network in known galactic space. The video file, officially labeled immigration_processing_incident_nexus7_timestamp_144207, became the most watched piece of media in recorded galactic history. The original footage accumulated over 47 billion views in its first standard day online. The slow-motion analysis versions got another 23 billion. The remix, where someone added classical Terran music to Amy's hip toss technique, garnered 15 billion more views, and spawned an entire subgenre of Deathworld classical combat videos. Alien social networks exploded with commentary. The Regillian equivalent of Twitter crashed twice from the sheer volume of posts tagged with Deathworld Girl, Spinecracker, and Sundress of Doom. Betazoid telepathic networks reported unprecedented levels of shared anxiety dreams featuring small human females in floral patterns. The Galactic News Network ran a breaking story titled "Breaking, Human Female Demonstrates Why Terra Classified as Deathworld Bureaucrat Hospitalized." The Centaurian broadcasting system went with "Elokul Alien Learns Important Lesson About Judging Books by Their Covers." The Klingon War Channel simply broadcast the footage on repeat for 72 hours straight with no commentary except occasional appreciative grunts. Defense contractors across 3 sectors immediately began reverse engineering Amy's technique, trying to understand how a 110-pound art student had managed to neutralize a 7-foot-tall alien with what appeared to be casual effort. The Vulcan Science Academy published a preliminary paper on the biomechanical impossibilities of Terran combat applications that was downloaded 6 million times in its first hour. Most significantly, immigration offices throughout the galaxy began taking Terra's warning classifications much more seriously. Applications from humans that had previously been processed with casual dismissal were now handled by senior officials wearing full protective gear. The phrase "it's just a human" disappeared from bureaucratic vocabulary overnight, replaced by nervous whispers of "make sure you're polite to the Terrans." The Andorian Art Institute, upon learning that their newest exchange student was the same Amy Kowalski featured in the viral footage, immediately upgraded her dormitory security, assigned her a personal liaison, and made sure that every staff member understood that their Terran student was to be treated with the utmost respect and courtesy. The dean personally sent a message to all faculty stating that Miss Kowalski should never, under any circumstances, be given anything less than exemplary customer service. Amy Kowalski arrived at the Andorian Art Institute 3 weeks later, completely unaware that she had become the most famous human in galactic history. She had spent her travel time reading art theory books and sketching nebulae through the transport ship's observation deck, blissfully ignorant of the fact that her fellow passengers were taking pictures of her from across the dining hall and posting them online with captions like "She looks so peaceful when she's not breaking spines." Her first day at the institute was a masterclass in barely controlled terror disguised as academic enthusiasm. Her professors greeted her with the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for handling volatile explosives. Her classmates, representing 17 different species, maintained what they thought was a respectful distance, but was actually the furthest they could sit from her while still technically being in the same classroom. Amy naturally attributed all this attention to normal new student curiosity and threw herself into her studies with characteristic enthusiasm. Her first landscape painting, a cheerful watercolor of the Colorado Rocky Mountains featuring wildflowers, a babbling brook, and what appeared to be a family of bears fishing for salmon, caused 3 Betazoid students to faint and had to be moved to a special viewing room with warning signs. Her professor, a distinguished Endorian master painter named Thivel, stared at the innocent-looking painting for several minutes before asking, "Miss Kowalski, are you certain this is an accurate representation of your home environment?" "Oh yes," Amy replied happily. "This is from near my childhood home. Though I did have to paint the bears from memory since they usually avoid humans. They're actually much larger and more impressive in person." Thivel made a note in Amy's file that simply read, "Student appears to have been raised in literal hell dimension. Recommend advanced placement in extreme environment studies." By the end of her first semester, Amy had inadvertently become the institute's most respected student. Her professors praised her unique perspective on environmental challenges and her intuitive understanding of survival aesthetics. Her fellow students treated her with a mixture of admiration and barely contained panic. Amy remained completely oblivious to her reputation as the Deathworld girl who broke a Zephyrian's spine while wearing a sundress. She just painted her landscapes, attended her classes, and occasionally wondered why everyone was so incredibly polite to her all the time. After all, she was just there to study art.